Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. We're going to give people just another minute or two to join the Zoom, and then we'll get started. You know, it's a busy time of year.
1 minute, maybe one more.
Yeah, just in case anyone's. Oh, that's
Yep, there you go. There you go. It's happening.
All right. Well, we can go ahead and go through some of our meeting logistics since we've got a lot of great content to get through today. So first, if you could just sign into the chat, let us know who's in the room by sharing name and pronouns, the name of your district, your role, and something you're looking forward to. For me, it's this upcoming long weekend.
So please feel free to come out mute or share in the chat. Like, this is a group that we are familiar with one another, so please feel comfortable.
All right, while we are all doing that, I will keep us moving. As always, this is a homeroom session, so that means participants are not automatically muted. So please just make sure that if you're not speaking, that you remain on mute. You can share your camera. We encourage you to do that so we can see your face and we can have a great, discussion, but obviously not necessary. If you have any questions throughout the training, please either use the raised hand icon on Zoom or put something in the chat, or feel free to come off mute if you think it's particularly pressing to whatever we're discussing at the time. We will be sending out the PowerPoint after the training, and Ani will also put the link for the slides in the chat. Sorry, Ani, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, sorry. I didn't realize I wasn't muted.
We will be using breakout rooms at the end of this session, depending how many participants we have today. So please be prepared for that and be prepared to share out at the end, because we'd love to know what you're discussing in those rooms. And then, of course, if you have any audio or video issues, we just ask you to try to leave the Zoom and come back in, and please let us know if you're having a persisting issue. Our agenda for today is to discuss the connection between domestic violence and homelessness, the impact of domestic violence-related homelessness, and then go over some strategies and best practices, have an opportunity for Q&A with our lovely guest speaker, and then we will go into our breakout sessions. So again, the objectives for this session is to understand the connection between domestic violence and homelessness, to understand the impact of domestic violence-related homelessness on children and youth specifically, and learn about resources to support families in these DV-related situations. You have probably seen this slide a million times, and you probably know who we are, but I'm Evelyn Guerin. I'm one of the Youth Housing Initiative Specialists here at COHHIO. I also have Ami Diallo, my colleague, on the call, and our lovely director, Amanda Wilson, is not here today, but she will be here for our next community of practice. And then we have the privilege of having Emily Kulo from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network to present with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to her.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just bear with me here for a second. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So as Evelyn mentioned, my name is Emily Kulo. My pronouns are she, her. I am the director of mobile advocacy and meaningful access here at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. And I have, and to answer the question, that was the kind of the icebreaker in the beginning. What I'm looking forward to is also this long weekend. It is going to be my soon-to-be 7-year-old's birthday on Saturday, so very exciting. And yeah, so I have been invited just to talk about that intersection of domestic violence, homelessness, and on the lives of youth and who you may be interacting with and are interacting with. So a little, just very brief background on me. I have been at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network for almost 7 years, but I did come from local DV programs in Northeast Ohio. So I did work in Northeast Ohio for about 12 years in a few different domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters, and have had a lot of experience both as an advocate and then also as a shelter manager, just around interacting with youth, specifically school-aged youth, and kind of how best to understand what kids are going through when they're coming into DV programming and into homeless shelters, and also navigating things like school issues and stuff. So please, I would encourage everyone, if there's questions throughout, just please unmute yourselves, put it in the chat. I would hope that this can be a meaningful conversation that we can move through. So to start us off, I want to just make that connection between domestic violence and homelessness. Domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children specifically. So the statistic is about 60% of women and children in even homeless shelters have experienced domestic violence, either as a direct result of them becoming homeless, or at some point in their life experiences that has then resulted in some other issues that could have made them homeless. And so I think that that is just something that's really, really important to focus on. Most of my experience has been around working with individuals in domestic violence shelters specifically. However, we're interacting with these survivors even if we are not interacting with them in a DV shelter. Many DV survivors are not accessing shelter for a myriad of reasons. There's a lot of barriers that certain individuals experience in accessing programming. And so there may be some community advocacy happening, but then also specifically those homeless shelters as well. So just kind of thinking through that lens that more often than not, you're interacting with somebody who has potentially experienced either domestic violence or another gender-based violence, either through the parents that we're working with, the caregivers that we're working with, or the children specifically that we're working with. And the other really important thing to think about throughout this presentation today is just that domestic violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. So everything we're going to talk about today is something that we really want to emphasize a holistic approach to when we're working with these individuals, when we're working with the children that we're coming in contact with, but also in working with the parents and caregivers. The more support we can provide to parents and caregivers, the more support that is getting to the children in these situations. And so really just kind of focusing on that holistic approach is really helpful when thinking through this. If people want to put it into the chat, or if you want to use your the Zoom logistics to raise your hand or something, how many people in your work with children have knowingly worked with children or caregivers that have either been in a domestic violence shelter or have been victims of domestic violence? I'd just like to get an idea of what's the context around this? Do people know of individuals? One person has raised their hand. Yeah.
Now you have 2, 3.
Yeah. Thank you. So, and I think my hope is that even if we didn't know in the beginning that there was domestic violence going on, that as we've gotten to know these families, that maybe that's come out and how best we can support them, specifically around community support, but then also around safety planning too, which is what we're gonna get into. So when a survivor comes in contact with any of our services, any domestic violence programming, any homeless programming, they're coming in with a lot of co-occurring issues. And oftentimes when a survivor comes into programming, when their children come into programming, we only have the opportunity to address certain things. And so we want to make sure that there are certain key elements that are in place when we're working with survivors and their children. And again, this I think can really translate into the work that you all are doing in the school system as well. But we really want to ensure that the physiological and safety needs are in place for a child and their family to be able to address some of these other things. So without the safety supports, without the physiological needs, children and survivors are not going to, it's going to be a lot harder to achieve things like the love and belonging, the community connection, the self-esteem building, the ability to kind of self-actualize. And so when we talk about youth in schools, especially we're going to talk about teens specifically here in just a little bit, but like if we're running into situations where teens are really struggling to even care about school, what else is happening around that comes into play? And so those of us as advocates, those of us as liaisons in these situations have the ability to help kind of intervene, help educate schools around kind of what they may be seeing with some of these youth that they're interacting with. So in domestic violence services, we focus on a holistic approach to advocacy. This is also something that can happen with you all as liaisons, making sure that we are focusing on the care and connection for survivors and their children that is survivor driven. And so one of the things that we talk about, and I should talk specifically about terminology, is that children are also survivors of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And so in DV programming, we can't address just the domestic violence that has impacted the parent or the caregiver without also addressing that impact that has been on the lives of the children and the teens in our programming. And so we want to ensure that it's survivor driven on both ends, that not only are we checking in on the needs of the survivor, we're checking in on the safety that is paramount for the parent or the caregiver, but we're also checking in on all of that for the children as well. We want to make sure that all of these interactions that we're having with survivors and their children is trauma informed. Every interaction that you have with a child, every interaction that you have with a parent or caregiver that has experienced this significant amount of trauma in their lives, that has colored their that has shaped the everything else that they are coming in contact with. So it's shaping how they're paying for school lunches. It's shaping how they're getting to and from school. It's shaping the just general ability to navigate things like homework or navigate things like interacting with peers or teachers, and all of that is impacted by the experiences that they've had, the traumatic life events that they've had. When we talk specifically about domestic violence, many teens and youth that we're coming in contact with, even outside of domestic violence, have had traumatic life experiences. But when there is domestic violence happening in the home or have recently happened in the home, it really can shake the world of these children. And so we really want to hold space for that and understand that a lot of the behaviors that I'm going to talk about here in a moment with regard to like what we may be seeing in some of the children is because of that domestic violence. Survivors and their children come with a lack of trust oftentimes in the different systems because there's been a lot of reasons why they haven't had that trust, right? There's been a lot of systems that have not been set up fully to support survivors and their children. And so, and their domestic violence, the abusive partner has often instilled in them a lack of trust in these different systems, right? They've been told that they can't tell the school what's going on. They've been told they can't tell their counselors what's been going on. And so there's just a lot of lack of trust. And so the more flexible we can kind of be with this population, the better chance we have of really making a connection with these individuals and also helping them succeed in whatever avenue it is that we are assisting them with, right? So it could be school, it could be success in the shelter, which is where advocates come in. It could be success in things like community engagement or finding housing or whatever it is that needs to happen. The more connection we can build on our end, the more understanding that we can have for this population is very, very helpful in providing them with that, setting them up with success. So one of the things that I'm hoping that we can accomplish today is talking through how the shelter advocates, how the domestic violence advocates can work together with you all to better set up these families for success. And so I'm hoping that out of today, we can come through with some ideas around how that might be something that we can achieve. The other thing I want to really emphasize is that, as I mentioned before, domestic violence does not happen in a vacuum. As a result of domestic violence, people become unhoused for many reasons. They either have to leave their they either have to leave the home that they are in with their abusive partner. Their domestic violence could have caused them to be evicted. Oftentimes we see that landlords will evict survivors and their families because of the police being called too many times, things like that. Abusive partners often will do things to damage the relationship that the survivor has with outside entities, and that can include their landlords, that can include forcing them to lose their jobs, that can include taking all of their money so that they can't pay their rent, that can include running up their credit so that they cannot obtain their own housing. So there's a lot of reasons why housing insecurity plays into that domestic violence and vice versa. And it's also very important to recognize that housing insecurity is trauma. So the parents and caregivers we're working with are experiencing trauma. They're experiencing trauma from the domestic violence itself, that they are experiencing the trauma from homelessness. Coming into shelter is also a traumatic experience. So we know that shelter is a necessary part oftentimes for survivors that can't stay in their home or have lost their home due to the domestic violence that they've experienced. But that shelter in itself is not the best case scenario for lots of folks, right? So when somebody's recovering from trauma, they need stability. Shelters don't often provide that stability, especially when we talk about children and teens. As we all know kids, right? We know that children need that stability, they need that structure. So even coming from a potentially very unstable home with an abusive partner or abusive parent, even coming into shelter is unstable and can potentially be a traumatic situation. If it's not traumatic in itself, it's still not going to help them recover from that trauma as much as being in their own home. So that's something that, when they're working with the DV program is going to be helping them as quickly as possible move into their own independent housing. But all of that is still a very traumatic experience and a very unstable experience. And we want to make sure that we're just recognizing that and honoring that. So when we see youth and children and teens in school and they are experiencing lots of different things, oftentimes we understand schools can become very, very frustrated with some of the behavior that they're seeing, which again, we'll get to in a minute. But recognizing that we're all advocates and we all have a role that we can play in helping kind of ease that, helping schools and administrators understand what's happening and what they're seeing, it can be really, really helpful. One of the other things that I want to emphasize is just how we all can work together. So many people may not know how many DV programs that we have across the state of Ohio. And so I know that this is not a great, you probably can't see this very well, but we have about 75 domestic violence programs across the state of Ohio. We serve even if there's not a specific shelter in a county, where you'll see like in some of these areas where like Union County or Madison County that are very rural and don't have an actual physical shelter, they still have DV services from one of the surrounding counties. And we have about 55 of them, I believe, are residential. So meaning that they do offer shelter. Some of our DV programs are community-based, so they don't have a shelter component, but all of our DV programs provide both they also provide community advocacy. So even if they're not a residential shelter, they're still going to provide that assistance with housing, assistance with support groups, assistance with safety planning. Even if they are shelter, they're also providing that community outreach as well. So that's something that I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of. We also have some culturally specific programs that, again, may not be a shelter themselves, but are going to be able to provide some of that wraparound support for families. Another important thing to note is that not every single DV program has what's called a youth advocate. However, every single DV program that you see here has youth services. So even if they don't have somebody that's a specific youth advocate, they do have youth services. They can still engage in, you know, liaising between schools, you all working to help advocate for them. Some might need a little bit more support from your end around like, what does this look like? But every DV program is serving youth. Every DV program is serving youth 18 and under. So there is not a domestic violence program, or there shouldn't be a domestic violence program that's saying that they only serve youth like 13 and under or anything like that. They're serving youth from 18 or under, and sometimes even more older than that if they are still residing with their parent or caregiver for some reason. Any specific questions? I want to pause here for just a moment. Are there any questions specifically around Ohio domestic violence programs or ODVN in general? I see that comment from Debbie that Genesis House in Lorraine does amazing things for our youth. Yeah, Genesis House is a really great program. So that's really good to hear. The other thing I should mention too is that if you're in a county that you see on this map, and if you can't see this map, I do apologize, but you can look at our map on our website too, on odvn.org, and you can get a bigger version of it. But if you are in a county, you're serving a county that does not have a domestic violence shelter, or you don't have a relationship with that domestic violence shelter, please reach out to us. We can help kind of initiate that. Many of you probably know Sonia Forensic, who is our trauma-informed care coordinator and youth coordinator, and she does a lot of work specifically with our domestic violence programs around youth advocacy. And so, yes, we do recognize that sometimes there is programming, unfortunately, when funding gets cut, because we're all nonprofits and grant funded, that funding gets cut. Sometimes DV programs sacrifice youth advocacy, which is not right, but is an element of something that happens sometimes. And so if you're running into any sort of frustrations in your county or a place that you serve with that domestic violence program, or you just don't have a connection, please just reach out to us and we can help connect you. So, the impact of domestic violence related homelessness on children and youth is really something that is a very real and heavy thing to acknowledge. When you have any homelessness, uh, impacts children and youth in a way that we all can, I think, understand because we are so familiar with working with that with children and teens. But when we are talking specifically around domestic violence related homelessness, oftentimes we have children that are coming to us and entering our schools that have experienced and seen a lot of things that we ourselves would really struggle to witness. When we talk about children need safety and security, right? That's the fundamental thing children need to be happy and to lead successful lives. And they are living and they have come from a situation where that was not an element. They did not have that safety and security. They didn't know from day to day whether their victim parent, so oftentimes we will say their mother, but it could be any gender of individual, but their victim parent is unsafe, which means that they are unsafe. And they are seeing a lot of violence that we would hope nobody would ever see, especially children. And then they were removed from that situation potentially and put into a homeless shelter, into a domestic violence shelter. And again, dealing with the kind of the trauma around that as well. And so really a lot of we're going to talk specifically around some characteristics that we see, some behaviors that we see, but really just want to set the stage for like why it is that we're seeing some of this stuff. If you are ever interested in learning a little bit more around the relationship between parents, caregivers, victim parents, and children, and then the abuser as well, Lundy Bancroft is a great resource. He is a advocate and author and somebody who has done a lot of work around that dynamic. And it can be really helpful. So this is just a quote that I like to throw in here because I think that it can really show how we are shaping the lives of children when they're witnessing some of this stuff, and then when they've come out of it, when potentially the mom or the victim parent is taking the steps to free themselves and their children from this relationship, how that can really color the lives and the perspectives of children. So when children enter shelter, one of the things that we do when a parent comes in with children into shelter is we kind of give them a heads up, like, listen, your kids might start behaving a little bit differently than they have before. And we see that for a lot of different reasons. So we see some very common stuff that happens when children enter shelter. We see that they suddenly have trouble sleeping oftentimes, or their schedule just gets really messed up and confused. We obviously know, like, if we have children, we know that every little thing can mess with a child's sleep cycle, right? So like a full moon, we were just talking about a full moon before this started, that messes with my kids. Suddenly wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and throw parties because of the full moon. And so elevating that kind of times 100 when they're coming into a new environment, they have left behind what they know, even if it is unstable, it is what they know. And they're coming into potentially also a kind of a chaotic situation with lots of other families, lots of other children in a different bed that smells different, looks different. The rules sometimes are different. And so you can see a lot of sleep disruptions. Schedule disruptions are also, again, a really huge thing. We'll see them act out. Oftentimes parents will come to us and be like, I don't know, my child never usually acts like this. This is very strange and different for me. And letting them know that, that is actually a very normal reaction to this this very large change in their life. So oftentimes parents are reluctant to engage in the system. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of trust issues that can come with that. And so getting parents to engage in the different systems that can help them. We know that when we're interacting with children and parents in either within the DV shelter, within the DV programming, or with on your end, when you're trying to navigate connecting that child to a school or connecting that transportation to their home school or whatever that looks like, we're all there to help, right? We know that we're all there to help, but oftentimes parents are very reluctant in that. And so when I mentioned in the beginning that not only are we talking about children in these situations, we're also talking about the parents and their care and the caregivers in these situations, and holding space and understanding that is very helpful. It can be very frustrating. I understand when you have a parent or a caregiver that you don't feel like they want to engage in this or help in this situation when you're trying to navigate it with their children. But understanding why you're seeing that can be very helpful. Taking the time to build that connection can be really helpful in helping parents understand that like you're in this with them, you're on their side, you're their advocate too, just as much as we are in that DV program. We also see an over attachment from kids in shelter, and I'm sure that this is something that you can also see in your end as well, and teachers can see as well. So if teachers are saying that they're seeing some really clinginess in children, there is a reason why. Children often will become over attached to positive figures when they've had a lot of negative experiences, and so understanding that that's normal. Something that's really important when you're seeing that is helping to direct that attachment back to the victim parent. So abusers often will have worked very, very hard to break down the relationship between the victim parent and the child. And so oftentimes when you see a child that's over attaching to one of us, trying to navigate that and put redirect that attachment back to the victim parent can be really, really helpful in establishing a new relationship between victim parent and child. Another important thing to keep in mind is that these experiences differ between child to child. So you may have 2 or 3 children in one family unit that are all acting very different. And we're going to get into kind of the different ages too. With littler kids, with younger children, you may see that they're a little bit more resilient in some ways, that maybe they don't appear to be as impacted by some of the stuff that they've experienced. Older children are going to be a little bit more aware of what's been going on, and then as a result, their behavior is a little bit different. So some of that we see in teens in shelter. We see what we have termed as parentification. This was not a word, but we've kind of created it as one because we have seen, and you'll see this a lot in teens that have had to grow up too fast and have experienced too much, that when there's a lot of chaos and disruption and trauma in a family unit, that the older child will take on a lot of those parental duties. The victim parent is often in survival mode for a lot of the time, and so somebody needs to help get the younger kids up and dressed and fed and on the bus and stuff like that. So you'll see a lot of that. One thing that's very important to note with all of this, though, is that with parentification, you can also see the flip side with people who are interacting with adults who are interacting with those teens, that they see this this teenager that is potentially taking on a lot of the responsibilities, and so they expect more from that teen. They expect that teen to be well behaved and to make right decisions and things like that because they've had to take on that parent role. And that's something that can be a very big bias and judgment on our end that we don't want to fall into. So being patient with those teens, understanding that there may be some attitude from teens as well, and that's normal. That would be normal with any youth and adolescent, but then specifically when they are very frustrated because they've had to take on that parent role. Another thing that we see sometimes is over-identification with one parent, and that is not always the victim parent. So we will sometimes see that teens who have lived in a domestic violence home for a period of time will over-identify with the abusive partner. They have listened to that abusive partner put the victim parent down quite a bit, and that impacts how that child sees the victim parent, right? And so oftentimes you will see that they will lash out sometimes at the victim parent, because they have just been told repeatedly that this person, doesn't know what they're doing, that they aren't a good parent. And so just thinking through some of that and understanding why you might be seeing some of that. And a very important thing when you are seeing that in teens is to make sure that you're highlighting how strong and brave and resilient that victim parent has been to keep their children safe. And that's something that both the victim parent needs to see, and also those teens and other children need to see as well. And then we'll see a lot of anger and outbursts, obviously, because there's a lot of frustration that comes into this. And so really understanding that, we want to make sure that any adults that are coming in contact with these individuals, with these children, aren't just shutting down because they're frustrated with that behavior that they're seeing. Understanding why we see that behavior and holding space for that person to feel what they're feeling, because it's all very valid, and making sure that we're validating that is just as important as how much we're validating that victim parent. I always like to emphasize that showing up once for any child that we're working with is so important. I think that every one time we show up for a teen, we have the ability to shape a little bit of their lives. And I think that we all have experiences with that. We can all we all have examples either from, pop culture or our own personal lives where there has been an external adult that has helped to shape that child's life. And so knowing that every interaction we have every one interaction we have with that teen, every one interaction where we are advocating for the life of that person, can be really helpful in how we're shaping their lives in the long run. So, how can we be as trauma informed as possible? And a lot of this, I'm hoping, can also be relayed to schools if we have that opportunity to say, yes, we recognize that this child is a victim of domestic violence. Their parent or caregiver is a victim of domestic violence. Let's be as trauma informed as possible when interacting with them. So again, always validating the strengths of the parent, but also validating the strengths and resiliency of children. I can't emphasize that enough, that kids need to be validated so much. They have experienced so much more than we would ever expect them to experience, ever hope that they would never have to experience. And so all of that is very valid. All of the ways that they're feeling is very valid. And just making sure that we are constantly reminding them of their strength and their courage. Showing them patience. Advocating for them and for their parents in schools is really, really important. We are all advocates. I think I mentioned earlier, we're all advocates. And so we can advocate in all of our different worlds, right? And so making sure that we're kind of working through that with them. One of the things that I want to make sure that we're talking about is specifically around how we safety plan with parents and caregivers and youth, and then the schools specifically. So unfortunately, abusive partners use children as a means to continue control over their abusive partners. And we don't have perfect systems. Our systems are not set up fully to not allow this to happen. So right now, in Ohio, even with a lot of domestic violence going on in a home, abusive partners will still get visitation and custody of children very, very often. And so the victim parent is constantly having to navigate that. Once they leave a domestic violence relationship, even if they come into shelter, even if they've gotten their housing, they're doing what they need to do, and they are, for lack of a better term, a success, they're still having to navigate that relationship. Unfortunately, they will have to navigate that relationship at least until their children are 18 years or older. And so abusers have that ability to always have access to that parent. And so listening and validating the parent is very important in working through how you're communicating between the parent, the shelter, and the school. Having that individualized safety plan that the advocate at the DV program can help with. So making sure that there's safety plans in place at the school for what to do at the individual level if like the abusive parent shows up and all of that. We don't expect you to be experts on safety planning for this population of people, but working with that DV program is really, really helpful in figuring out how to safety plan for that individual. Sometimes there's not an easy solution if there is visitation that's in place, if the abusive partner is allowed to come and pick up the children. There's not a lot that can be done sometimes, but figuring out different ways that can be safer for the victim parent to navigate that can be helpful. If there is a protection order in place, though, then we do have more resources to help protect the victim parent and the children. If children are named in a protection order, then that protection order can go to the school and can be enforced by the school. If you are running into a situation where that school is not wanting to abide by the protection order, then we would want to make sure that we are doing everything on our end to be able to educate the school that you have to. So if there is a CPO, if there's a protection order in place and the children are named, then that offender, that abuser cannot come to the school and pick up the children, and they would want to have a plan in place for what to do if somebody tried to do that. Thinking through safety planning specifically, you can think of it kind of as like an IEP, but for families with domestic violence and in unsafe situations. So yes, there may not be a lot of state law behind how to respond, but there is some individualized safety planning that can take place with the help of the shelter advocates when you're trying to navigate that. Does anyone have any questions specifically around civil protection orders and what to do in the event that there is one in place? Another thing that's really important to note is just those barriers that are going to be in place for survivors of domestic violence and their children. So attendance is a huge thing when we're talking about domestic violence. If a parent, a victim parent and children are in shelter, oftentimes they're navigating a brand new schedule. So that can be difficult when trying to figure out, what time to catch the bus, what time to get to the school, all of that kind of thing. They are living in a situation where there's multiple kids, and so that can be a little bit chaotic in the beginning to figure out who is going where and what bus is picking them up from where and all of that kind of thing. And being patient and educating the school on being patient when we're trying to work that stuff out. So another thing that's really important when we talk about teens specifically, what we sometimes see, and you've probably seen this too, is in high schools and middle schools, teachers and administrators can sometimes get really frustrated when a child is missing a lot of school or they're late to school because of living in shelter. And then the teen sometimes gets blamed for that. Like they sometimes have, like they are supposed to have control over what time they get to school. And just keeping in mind that that might mean that the teen is helping to get all of their younger siblings up and on the bus as well. And so just holding space for that and being as patient as possible and helping to educate the school to be as patient as possible with some of that. And I understand the frustration that, you know, schools are doing amazing work and they're managing lots and lots and lots of lives and human bodies and all of that kind of stuff. And so it is a very challenging situation, but it's a very real situation for a lot of families that are navigating all of the different school districts in Ohio, regardless of whether it's a rural school or an urban school, or whether it's a lower socioeconomic area or a higher socioeconomic area. It's happening across the board. And so just really holding space for that and recognizing that this population is in all of these different schools and being patient and holding space for that. So what does youth advocacy look like in domestic violence programming? So again, even if there's not a youth advocate specifically that is, you know, paid a youth advocate salary, there are people that take on that role of youth advocacy. It may be the resident advocate, it may be a shelter advocate. They have lots of different titles depending on what shelter you're working with, but they're going to be doing some parent and guardian intakes. They do things like assisting with transportation. So again, helping to connect those dots for that child around transportation, assisting with the school transition. They are themselves liaisons in a lot of ways, and so working with them can be really helpful. They're going to be doing a lot of activities with children in shelter. They're going to be doing a lot of activities with parents and children to help kind of unify that relationship again, because again, it's been broken often. And so they're doing a lot of that kind of stuff. Some shelters in Ohio have youth-specific support groups for things that they've experienced. Some DV programs in Ohio have actual clinical counselors on staff that might meet with parents or with children. And so there's a lot of work that's being done on the side of the DV programs around youth and around school. And so you know, I think thinking through like how we can help you all do some of your work, I think is something that I hope that we can accomplish through this conversation. So, you know, if you all are seeing something in your community that you're struggling with, how can our youth advocacy and DV programming help support that in any way? So just thinking through some of that stuff. So some things that I want to make sure that we talk about is what DV programs can do specifically for children, school-age children. So when children enter shelter, they do qualify for school lunches, and those school lunches can also continue on past the time they leave shelter. So children can continue to receive a free and reduced school lunches if they've been in shelter and even after they've had their own housing. So that's something that's really important to note, because I'm sure that's a challenge that you're all seeing. It's a challenge that we often see, is that parents don't have the ability to pay for school lunches. And so knowing that even after they leave shelter, they can still qualify for those school lunches is really, really important to note. We can also provide supplies for youth entering school. So we would have just recently helped a lot of children with clothes or uniforms. We have the ability to purchase school supplies, school backpacks, any of that kind of thing. We have the ability to help with medical needs for children. So helping them obtain EpiPens, helping to advocate for the needs of medically fragile children, children with IEPs. That's a huge thing that also I think we can help to work together on. Oftentimes, survivors of domestic violence are struggling to understand things like advocating for IEPs. As a mother myself who has a child that's on an IEP, it can be daunting even for somebody like me who is an advocate to have to advocate for their child and know the best way to do that and not feel like we're burdening the school too. You know, I know specifically, like sometimes I feel like I'm a burden to the school because I need to advocate for my child with an IEP. And so any of that burden that we can take on for that victim parent can be really helpful. And so DV programs can do that, staff at DV programs can do that and work with you all to help navigate that as well. And then, you know, I'd really like to hear from you all, like what else can DV programs do to better support your needs? So we provide resources and education for all of the domestic violence agencies across Ohio. It is Sonia's greatest challenge is making sure that we are, you know, doing everything we can for the lives of children. And so if there's a need that you all are seeing that maybe you're not getting in a community, please let us know. Anything that we can pass on to our DV programs across Ohio, we will be sure to do that. Just next week, or actually this week, oh my goodness, we have a 2-day leadership retreat that's coming up with all of our executive directors for all of the DV programs across Ohio. So we will have over 100 shelter directors and executive directors coming to Columbus for a 2-day retreat here in the next two days. And so we have the ability to communicate with them any needs that you're seeing, especially as the school year has just started. I am sure that there is many things that are fresh in your mind. And so please let us know if you want to share now, if you want to ask questions now is a great opportunity, or share that with our contact information and we can follow up. So that's a lot of information. Any questions that anybody has?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's her background.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was such a wonderful and very informative presentation. I've learned so much sitting here. I'm like, wow. And thank you for advocating and thank you for the work that you do. I mean, this was awesome. So our usual is we go into breakout rooms, right? Because we want to talk to liaisons. But today I was wondering, I want to give you the options. Do you guys want to have that conversation right here? Let's discuss it since we don't have a lot of time. Or do you want to go in the breakout room? You can either raise your hands, use the emoji or the chat, whatever works best for you. So breakout room is? Okay. So Evelyn, can you please put them in the breakout rooms and we're going to share the questions with you. Okay, I need to leave at 2. That's totally okay, Debbie, even if we can have 2 minutes of your time to respond and have whatever you've been dealing with. And can you please share the screen? Thank you. So in the breakout room, we're gonna ask you how the district or ESCs are responding to families in DV situation. And I'm gonna put this question in the chat, and also Evelyn is gonna be broadcasting them in case you don't have it. And please take notes and be prepared to report with the group so we know what you've discussed. Thank you. Let me put this in the chat.
Gonna help me at testing time?
All right, breakout rooms are open, so feel free to start popping over there, and we will pull you back in 5 minutes. I know it's a little brief, but we want to make sure you have time to share out. So we will see you soon.
And I just put the questions in the chat as well. Thank you, guys. See you soon.
Ami, do you want to pause the recording?
Yes. Thank you for saying that.